So going into this, I'm going to go in with the mindset of what is the goal of software architecture? And with software architecture, ideally, you want to be able to minimize the human maintenance and building of the system. You want a system that's easy to build from a developer standpoint. You want it easy for them to maintain going forward. Having worked with many businesses, you know that the scope for the initial application is going to be one thing, and then they're going to want everything in the kitchen sink under there. So you want to be able to grow that application. And with a clean architecture approach, that's what you'll be able to do. So with our presentation today, we're going to go ahead and talk about a high-level clean architecture overview. I'm not going to go too in depth with it because there's a lot of different architectures that come into play. We're going to look at the template, the prerequisites. So when you signed up for the webinar, I emailed you the prerequisites if you want to code along by testing some of these commands and deep diving on your own machine, which is fine. But we'll do a demo then and talk through the different layers. We have some additional resources. And if you need to contact us, how you can reach us as well. If you have any questions, please ask in the chat, and we'll take breaks to answer them as we can, as time allows. If we run out of time for those questions, though, we may have to end up answering them in a blog post. And when we do that, we will make sure to send a link to that in the mailing list as well. All right, so clean architecture. What is it? So you'll hear about it. You might hear terms like onion architecture or hexagonal architecture, which is also known as ports and adapters. You may hear of data context and interaction, or DCI. Boundary control entity is BCE. These are all different types of architectures that have been around over the years. And by say the years, we're talking not just within like the past 5 years, we're talking 20, 30, 40 years. These are things that have evolved over time. But the goals here is you have your business logic that is separated from your technical decisions. The technical decisions should not be part of the business logic. And I mentioned in our blog post that I have here with that QR code that your business logic should not rely on whether you choose SQL Server or SQLite or Postgres for your database. That shouldn't matter. Whether you're using Google for email or Outlook for email or on-prem Exchange server, that should not affect your business logic. That should be just separated. When it comes to maintaining it, then it becomes easier when you're like, oh, the business logic changed. Okay, we can change it. We don't have to necessarily go change our technical decisions. This is the clean architecture diagram. In the blog post, you'll see the one that's in the clean architecture book, but I figured with this one, let's simplify it a little further. Let's see what's at those layers. So we have the enterprise business rules in the center, and we go from innermost to the outermost layers. Enterprise business rules, this is something company-wide. The enterprise business rules could possibly be shared by multiple applications. So be aware of that. The application business logic, on the other hand, is going to be specific for the application you're working in. Then you've got your interface adapters. So you've got your interfaces will be stored in a different layer, but the interface adapters are the things that are going to implement those changes. And then at the top or outermost, you have frameworks and drivers. Now, what are the specifics of those? We will take a look at that and talk a little bit more about those layers as we deep dive into them. But just so that you're aware, there's also dependencies. So there, you'll see the arrows pointing in. So enterprise business rules, it does not need to know about the application business logic. It doesn't need to know about interface adapters. It doesn't need to know about frameworks and drivers. Typically, enterprise business rules will have few to no external dependencies. I say few because occasionally, and in our case in the template, you'll see reliance on a library, but for the most part, you want as little dependencies as possible at your core. But everything on the outside, they can refer back to the other inner layers. So frameworks can work with interface adapters, and sometimes you'll see core as well. And what we're going to look at today, this is the approach to clean architecture that our friend Ardalis made. So this is an opinionated approach. That means that there were some decisions that were made. You're going to see some things here that are going to be like, oh, there's MVC, there's Razor, there's fast endpoints, there's APIs. But then you're also going to see other things like, well, what's this? Domain-driven development. These are all practices that we deal with here at NimblePros, and you can see that here in the clean architecture template. There are going to be 4 different layers. So there's core, There's shared kernel, there's infrastructure, and there's web. And those are in the source folder. There's also tests. And when we get to the code, I'm probably going to jump straight into the tests so you can take a look and see what other things we have implemented in there. Now, when I sent you the email, I mentioned that I was going to show this in .NET 7 or higher. Today it is .NET 7. I do not have the .NET 8 preview installed. There are tags available though for other .NET versions as well. So rest assured, if you're not on .NET 7, don't panic. There's .NET 3.1, .NET 5, .NET 6, even .NET 2.0. So some of the older .NETs. There's tags for all of those in the repository. And I've got a command that I'll show you as to how to work with this. All right, so what's included? So the code that's in there is a template. I can't stress this enough. So many people are going to be like, it looks like a to-do item like app. It is not a full app. This is going to give you ideas on how you can use your template. If you want to use it for APIs, if you want to use it for apps themselves, it gives you an idea for the organization. But again, remember, this is an opinionated approach and a template. This is not a full application. We have an example of a full application here toward the end, so stay tuned. But in this one, you'll see passing tests. And I like to call it a choose your own adventure kind of template because it does show APIs. It does show front end. So there's going to be the core project, which again has few to no external dependencies. Now you'll see a value object in this template. This goes back to domain-driven development. But you'll also see things like your DTOs, your interfaces, your specifications, entities, things like that will belong here at the core layer. If you're dealing with DDD, you'll see entities and aggregates and domain services and event handlers. All of those are within the core. Okay, the shared kernel object, or the project, is another concept from domain-driven development. And this is code that's shared between multiple, what they call bounded contexts. You may see it for your own code as it makes sense to keep it as a project. You may see that it gets really large and may actually be made up of several projects, in which case turn it into a NuGet package. So there's what the shared kernel project is used. The way it's used is you're going to see it used with multiple contexts where you're going to have like one model or parts of a model that are shared for those different contexts, such as like orders, with inventory, things like that. The thing I'm willing to caution you with shared kernel is that it can lead to tight coupling between your contexts. So we have a lot of loosely coupled stuff, but this can lead to tight coupling. So I have to call that out. The infrastructure project. So this is what's going to implement those interfaces that are defined in core. This includes things like your data access and your domain events. But if you're dealing with like file access or API, email providers, infrastructure decisions, all tend to show up in the infrastructure project. We will take a look at data access specifically because it shows that they have the initial decision is SQLite. In the README, there's also a mention of SQL Server. And I also have a blog post on how to convert it over to Postgres. So you're not locked into a single data decision, but just so you know where to find that, so that if you want to implement a different database, you can. And then there's the web project. So the web project, I like to think of it better as the UI layer. And that's just because it could include a console application. It could be a web application. It could be all sorts of different types of applications. It doesn't have to necessarily be web. It could be mobile, but it's your UI layer. You may see that it makes use of environment variables or app settings.json for configuration. And then you'll see throughout all the projects, we use dependency injection using AutoFac. All right, so we have a template, which makes our lives easier for starting with clean architecture, but how do we get it? So there are two main things to think about. You can download the source from GitHub. If you're going to just use it as is, you can just download it. If you are going to make changes to the template that you want others to use, you can fork the repository. If you have commit access to the repository and can make changes, you can also clone the repository. So there are three different ways you can deal with that for GitHub. There's also the .NET CLI template, which is what we will use, which is maintained by Ardalis. There may be a question for those who have looked at this, like, well, what about the Visual Studio templates? There is a Visual Studio template for Clean Architecture that uses Ardalis's Clean Architecture template. However, it uses .NET 5. We do not maintain that version at all, and so we're not going to show that. So if you do see any references to it, just know that we haven't seen any updates to it, so we do not recommend it at this time. Now, to install that template via .NET CLI, you're going to do one of two things. You can either do the latest template, which is just do .NET new, install, and then it's ardalis.cleanarchitecture.template. However, this is going to be the latest and greatest. If you are not at the latest and greatest versions, if you're at an older version, for example, then you could check the NuGet gallery, and the NuGet gallery will have the different versions for you. So then you can say .NET new install Ardalis Clean Architecture template, the double colons and the version. Once you have it installed, then if you do .NET new list, you should see Clean Arch as its short name. Now don't panic if you're trying to code along and you're like, I didn't see that command. It's going to be coming right back when we get into the demo of the code. I'm going to try to get us out of the slides as soon as we can so we can get into the code and explore. Okay, so once you once you install the template, then you need to create a solution off that template. The gotcha at the moment is you can't use a dash in your solution folder name. If you use a dash, it will cause some problems. Now I have a screenshot later here that will show you what that message looks like, just so you're like, oh no, I did a dash, what did I do? I've got you. All right, so no dashes in the solution name. No dashes in the folder that you're going to be running your application from. That causes headaches. We're going to create the solution with the template using the .NET new CLI command. So it's .NET new clean dash arch. That dash is okay. So it's .NET new clean dash arch dash O and then your solution folder name. Where you see your solution folder name, that's where there's no dashes allowed. And then you can do your .NET restore. Now, when you create your solution, this is what you're going to see on the side. You'll see the solution folder. You'll see that there's the source. Under the source are those projects that I was talking about, the core, the shared kernel, the infrastructure, and then your web. And then for tests, we have integration, functional, and unit tests in there as well. So we'll look at that when we get into the code. Notice that we also have the directory build props and packages props. So this is at the solution level. I'll show you what's in those. Got ahead of myself on the slides here, but so you can see the breakdown. This is what the solution is going to look like. So you've got your core, your infrastructure, shared kernel, and web. And for the template, they're all separate projects here. Okay, I'm going to jump into the demos. The first one I want to show you, I actually have a video for it because I've already done it, but this way you can code along too. So if you're going to code along with this, bring up your terminal where you can run the .NET CLI, because this is a command you want to run. So first things first, let's get that template installed. So at your command prompt, go ahead and type .NET, then space new, space install, space Ardalis, that's ARDALIS, .clean architecture, .template. It'll look something like this. I'll bring it back so you can see. Once you have it installed, you should see success. You should see Ardalis Clean Architecture template and then the version. You'll also see the template name and that short name. That short name is what you're going to use for creating your solution. You have to tell it which template you want to use. So that's the one that we'll use. Okay. So then once you have the template installed, the next thing you'll do is you'll create the solution. Now, remember what I said about no dashes? Other than the clean arch, that short name is allowed to have a dash, but your solution name is not. Try this and see what you see. If you do .NET space new space clean dash arch space -o space clean dash arch dash demo and press enter, it will create the solution. But if you go to build that solution, that's where you're going to see issues. So when you once you create the solution, open up the solution in Visual Studio. And when I show my Visual Studio here in a little bit, my Visual Studio is using Visual Studio Community Edition. I prefer to show the Community Edition for demos because then everybody who sees this can play along and can code along. When you go to build a solution, when the dash is in the name, you should see an error similar to what I have on this slide. And I've highlighted that clean arch demo in underscores so you could see that's not the dashes that we were hoping for. This is already a known issue. So this has already been logged with us on the GitHub. But just so you're aware, we will call it out. Do not use the dashes in your solution name. Now today, because we're talking about starting from scratch, starting in a greenfield environment, you can just go ahead and remove the files and folder with the dash in the name and recreate it without the dashes. So for example, you might want to do something like this, where it's .NET space new space clean dash arch space -o space, and then whatever your solution name is going to be. You may have different naming standards at your company or on your own personal projects. So use the naming standards that meet your needs. Our proposal here is your company.solution name. So you'll see for my demo, it's nimblepros.webinar demo. Once the template, the solution has been created, then you can change into the directory and you should be able to see the different files that are loaded. And at this point, I'm going to switch over to my Visual Studio. Any questions so far? All right. All right, so let's take a look at Visual Studio. I'm going to close all of these. Bring up my Solution Explorer so we can look at the structure first. All right, so this was created using the Clean Architecture template. So you'll see that there's a source with our core, our infrastructure, our shared kernel, and our web. And then there's also tests. And just to show that there's no tricks up my sleeves, I'm going to go ahead and run my tests. Maybe, can I get the zoom bar to move? Yep, zoom move. Okay. going to come in here and I'm going to do test and run all tests. Why am I running all the tests? That's because the tests will trigger the build. If the build fails, we will catch that, but otherwise it should run just fine. I'm going to come to the test explorer. And you can see that it has run 26 tests. Now, what I like about the tests is that it shows you a lot of the different decisions that were made in the template. I'm gonna drag out my test explorer a little bit more so we can see the names here. So I don't need the traits right now, so traits can go. There we go. Okay. And you'll see that there's 3 integration. If we look at the integration tests, so right now you see EF repository, add, delete, and update. So that's one of our decisions that was made. We're using Entity Framework Core. And with the tests and Entity Framework Core, what else do we have going on in here? What other decisions were made? So you can see that we're talking about project aggregates. If you're seeing aggregates, you can think of domain-driven development. We're also using XUnit, so you're going to see facts. You may see some theories and inline data as well. Looking at this, you can see, of course, there's async going on. So Entity Framework, that's a data decision. Delete and update are going to have similar things to show you the data decisions there. We go to updates item, for example. You're going to see that it does its DB context. So again, Entity Framework Core at the database level. So that's what's going on in integration tests. In the functional tests, we're going to expand some of those so you can see what's going on there. We're going to look at the API. We'll look at returns one project. So you can see how it's dealing with that. You'll see that we have seed data. So rest assured that the data is, there's a seed there, so you can run this. If we go into get into deserialize async, you can see that we're using Ardalis's HTTP client test extensions. If you haven't checked out Ardalis's profile on GitHub, he has all sorts of different tools that make our lives easier as developers. From the HTTP client testing to guard clauses to the result library, you'll see all sorts of them in here. But you can see the decisions that were made here looking at the tests. There's one I want to show about the 2 contributors. No. That's that. We do have the incomplete items. So what you see here, go into this incomplete item spec. This is using Ardalis specification. So we're using the specification pattern. And you'll notice that in here, it has this query and where, so this is, you'll see specification throughout. Again, this is to make it a little bit easier for querying for items. And again, another Ardalis tool to make our lives a bit easier on that. The other thing I want to show with this filter collection is this mark complete. Notice here we are in the core project, and it is implementing something called the entity base, which you'll see with your entity framework. But with mark complete, the thing I want to call out here is this register domain event. So if you aren't familiar with domain-driven development, you will be picking up all sorts of contexts in here. But rest assured, if you don't need that part, you can take it out. Register domain event, just so you can see what's going on. So this is in your entity base. And this is going to then trigger the domain events, which then do some logic. All right, and in this particular case from our complete, just so you can see what that does, this does this to do item completed event. I am pressing F12 to navigate. I'm using Visual Studio Community Edition with no additional plugins, no resharper, none of the additional tools that you might see in your environment, but just so you can see how this works. So this will pass in an event and handle it from there. This to-do item completed event lives in core. Okay. These are just some of the many design decisions. So whenever I'm in an application, that's one of the things I like to do is to go into the test to see, okay, what is going on in the domain? I want to understand more about the words and what's going on there. But I also want to understand what kind of design decisions were made. Okay. So we have that, but let's take a look at, okay, we've got the decision of entity framework with SQLite. Are you using SQLite in production? You may, if it's a small application that makes sense to, but you may be using something else like SQL Server or Postgres. And how do you decide what to do and what to change? Well, in this, let's take a look so you can see. We're going to look at the web project. I'm going to show you first seed data, so you can see that there is sample data in here to work with. We'll see here that it's getting the required service from the service provider, and then it'll populate that test data. So it'll add contributors, it'll add some sample to-do items using Entity Framework Core. So how does Entity Framework know where it's connecting to? So if you're changing your database, you don't need to change your data for the seed data. You can use what's already there. Or you can change it to seed data more for your domain. Let's go into program.cs within the web project. We're going to go down to what right now it's line 26, but if somebody were to watch this recording afterwards, they may wonder where they're looking at. You're gonna look here at the line that says connection string. And then the connection string is gonna pull it, and it's gonna get the connection string from the configuration, and it's gonna look for SQLite connection. That configuration is in this app settings.json. So in app settings.json, you can come into the connection string section, add another connection string or change it to whatever connection string you need to. So I could put in like a Postgres or a SQL Server connection string. And then once I put that in there, then all I would need to do is come back to my program and change it here to whatever it is. So if I were to say something like my Postgres connection string, if I go into my app settings, if I were to say something like Postgres connection, I'll just leave it empty for now. So I'll save that, go back into my program around line 26, where that connection string is, change the name to Postgres connection to match my key. Now that's just one part, because that's the web layer. If you remember from the slides, I mentioned that data layers tend to be configured at the infrastructure project. So the web needs a connection string, but then the actual what's going on under the covers, that's an infrastructure. So I'm going to go into my infrastructure project, which is called NimblePro's Webinar Demo Infrastructure. Collapse the web one and collapse the tests, just to make it a little easier for us to see what's going on. And we're going to look at startup setup.cs within the infrastructure project. Your startup setup, it looks very small, like, what's going on? But it's that add DB context that you need to pay close attention to. Add DB context is going to tell Entity Framework what database it's working with. By default, this is using SQLite. You may have to change for SQL Server. You change it to use SQL Server with its connection string information. And then for Postgres, you would use NPG SQL. And I have a blog post on that, where I walk you through the steps for changing that. I have to caution you, if you're using Postgres, from a developer perspective, looking at our code without going into the queries, nothing else will change other than the use MPG SQL and pass in the connection string. However, your business analysts or your folks on the side who are querying that data will run into issues with Postgres. And the reason why I have to point this out is because we run into it recently. And folks are like, I know I have a table and I know that my table is called contributors, but my table is actually called contributors with a capital C. In our code, as developers in C#, we understand how Entity Framework is going to capitalize our database things to match our entities as is. We can change that for where we need to, but with Postgres, the gotcha with it is that it takes the queries and converts them to lowercase. So when you do a select star from contributors, for example, because you want to see all your contributors, that's not going to work. It'll tell you that it can't find contributors with a capital C. So then you have to do it with a lower C. Entity Framework handles its thing fine, but querying the data directly, it's just a gotcha to know about. And there's a EF core.naming conventions that can, if you're doing this right greenfield, you can implement the EF core naming conventions into one of the lowercase naming conventions, like a snake case, or just straight lowercase. That way it gets easier for folks to have to write the queries, because then they don't have to put things like double quotes around table names or double quotes around field names. There is a question about other solutions where they register the DB context with an autofact module. You can do that. You can do that. This was just the decision that we had made with the startup setup in the Clean Architecture template. Okay, what else do we have? Some other things that we have. So we do have this, we saw the specification pattern. You are seeing autofac. Just so you can see that there's these default modules. So the default infrastructure module. So now you're seeing, this is where we get into the things like the assembly get assemblies. And then registering dependencies, all that stuff. You'll see here mediator. So we've got the mediator pattern in here as well. We have domains from domain-driven development. The fake email center and SMT email center. So Ardalis has a blog post about how that works. So I will include at the end of this webinar, or if you're watching this after the fact, you will receive an email that has links to the blog post that we're referring to, in addition to this recording. All right. Let's see, what other decisions do we have to show? The build I did mention. So this is running .NET 7 and the packages. So we also have coverlet in here for doing code coverage, as well as mediator and Serilog. There's a report generator, SQLite. These are all done here in the directory packages props. You will not see that in the older versions of .NET that don't have that support. So just be aware that the different versions of .NET will have different structures based on what that version of .NET supports. Okay. Let me switch back to the slides. All right. We showed that. So our databases, I showed they're wired up in startup setup, which is over in the infrastructure project. The app settings.json is where you'll store your the connection string within the web project. And then program.cs is where you tell it which key in app settings to use for your connection string. And that's programs.cs within your web project. Now you may be wondering, why did we choose EF Core? Why didn't you use ADO.NET or some other tool like the Dapper Micro or ORM or something like that? Again, these were just design decisions that we chose, specifically that Ardalis chose when he created this template. Okay. Now the template you can run straight from .NET CLI. And again, I can't stress it enough, it's just a template. However, there is an application that does use clean architecture. That's Microsoft's eShop on web. So let's take a look at that as well. Let me open that in Visual Studio so you can see what that looks like. And we'll see if we can get it to all right. I'm going to go ahead and share that. So eShop on web, this is what Microsoft uses. Make sure. I thought it's sharing that. Okay. So this is what Microsoft uses for their demo. And things you'll note. So this actually has some Docker composes in there. But then there's your source and there's your test. Now this is a little bit different because it has Blazor. So if you're working with Blazor, this is definitely something worth checking out to see how did they get that working. But you'll see that there's the core and then there's a Blazor shared. There's the Blazor admin, the web, there's infrastructure, and there's an API. You'll notice in terms of testing as well that we've broken out, there's the public API versus the unit tests and integration tests and functional tests. So kind of separate those out, make it easier to manage. How is this easier to manage? Well, when you have a problem, you only typically need to change it in one of a couple spots. And I say a couple spots because usually if you have to change the logic, you also have to change your tests, add tests, update tests. But if we go ahead and we're going to run all the tests for these, just so you can see what this looks like. And this is available on GitHub. And I will include that link in the post-meeting follow-up as well, so you can see how can you get started with this, seeing an application that's working. Oh. I'll change it. So, oh, Docker desktop, new laptop. So as long as you have Docker installed, then you can build this and run through this. But eShop on web, just so you can take a look at the code without running the Docker parts, get an idea of what it entails. So you're going to have your unit tests. And you're going to see any of the decisions that are made with that. Again, using XUnit, working with application core, that's where your entities are stored. So if we go back in our solution, just so you can see what kind of things are stored in the core. Again, you have your entities, which are your, if you're in DDD, domain-driven development, that's where those come into play. You've got your interfaces, your services. The specification pattern that we like to use is also the specifications are stored in the core. You've got your constants as well. So you can see, well, what's in constants? Well, that's why you have your authorization. Notice here, nothing super secret, but you'll want to put these in your configs and not share them. When you get into entities, this is where the aggregates live as well. So aggregates are typically nested under entities in their own folders. Custom exceptions. So this I can't stress enough in our code. Whenever you're writing code, use exceptions that make sense so that when you're debugging it later and you accidentally hit this exception, it's not just a null reference exception. Give yourself some context, both from a readability and then for your developer experience as well. Argument not null exception, that's another one. Which kind of argument not null exception? Where is this happening in the process? Make your lives easier and create those custom exceptions. Interfaces, these are fairly straightforward interfaces. So some of them have strings, some of them have methods as well. And then the extensions, so you can see what's going on there. So we have guard clauses. So if the basket for your checkout for this eShop is empty, then there's that empty basket on checkout exception. So guard clauses, if something's null, just get out. Throw the exception. Don't continue the logic. Okay. So how does core differ from the Blazor shared? Just so you can see. With Blazor shared, these are going to be Blazor specific. This is where you're going to have the Blazor specific interfaces. You're going to have the Blazor specific attributes, authorizations, all this stuff goes specifically for the Blazor applications. So we've got Blazor admin. If we look at web, just so you can see your dependencies, your frameworks, you've got your packages. You're going to see all different things, more decisions here as well, including Mediator and Ardalis's specification and the list startup services. So with these templates, these will allow you to get moving with clean architecture right away and a greenfield project. Now this should allow you to go ahead and incorporate them into your code. I'm going to back to our slides. And this eShop on web is also used in this book that was created by Ardalis called Architecting Modern Web Applications, which calls into various different architecture concepts to help get you started in ASP.NET Core and Azure. These are additional resources to help you get started with clean architecture. So we've got our blog post that sets up the story for today. We've got the actual template on GitHub. With the template, if you find that you're missing a feature, you can file an issue. You can consider maybe submitting a pull request. So it's an open source tool, as are the Ardalis libraries. So specification and guard clauses and result, they're all available on GitHub. There's a presentation from Ardalis on .NET Conf 2022 using clean architecture with .NET Core 7. He speaks a lot on clean architecture, so you'll find other videos from him at other conferences as well. You'll see he did a clean architecture with ASP.NET Core in general on his blog post. That's what the last link is. Clean architecture, though, is not limited to .NET. It is architecture. So I also wanted to make sure that you had links for other languages as well. So Python, Java, Rust, Go, these are some of the other languages out there. If you do a search for your favorite programming language and clean architecture, you may find a clean architecture template for you. I only have to say may, because if your favorite programming language is Fortran, I can't guarantee you that Fortran clean architecture exists. All right. And our next webinar is going to happen at the end of June. It's going to happen at the same time at 1 o'clock US Eastern Time on June 27th. And we're going to talk about real world CI/CD and taking you some of those tricks to boost your app's quality. So we're going to talk about things. You'll see coverlet and a report generator, for examples, code quality, and how to improve it using things like linters. That will be happening again on June 27th. If you're interested in learning more about this, if you have a code base that you're like, you know, Sarah, clean architecture looks awesome, but I am in a messy code base. I've got spaghetti code. But don't worry, we gotcha. Nimble Pros, we have a lot of folks who've worked with the various clean architecture templates and have worked with many legacy code bases as well. So we can help work with you on implementing clean architecture in your code. If you have code that is upgrading to .NET 7 and you need some assistance, you can also reach out to us that way. And if you need training for your dev team in clean architecture or any other software craftsmanship topics, feel free to contact us. The QR code will take you to our contact page. Same with that bit.ly link below, bit.ly/contactnp. Any other questions? We have a question about eShop on web and identity being set up in the infrastructure project. Is this the best place for it and why? So let me go ahead and open eShop on web back up. So we've got eShop on web. And you're looking at infrastructure and the identity. So with identity, let's take a look and see. I mean, I see their migrations too, but that's identity framework. One moment.
Hey, I'm here.
There we go.
Sorry, my audio settings were having trouble.
That's okay. I was just like, hold on. I'm sure Steve has a thought on this, so I want to unmute you on that.
Yeah, the question is, why is identity in infrastructure, or is it the best place to put the identity stuff? The main thing is you don't want to have the identity implementation logic in your domain model, so it shouldn't be in core, and you don't want to have that dependency on like ASP.NET identity or whatever you might be using for identity pulled into the domain layer. You want that to not know about that. So I do include the user ID inside core, but it's not a foreign key to the identity tables. And I don't put the actual identity user class inside of the domain model either. I try and keep that separate. So I make sure the identity user info is the application user, I guess, in eShop on web right there, is stored in infrastructure. Now, you don't have to put it in infrastructure if you want to put it in its own separate folder that's sort of at the same level as infrastructure, that would be fine. So if you, let's say, have a shared identity that you're going to use with a bunch of different applications, and you only want to have your application specific things inside your infrastructure project, then that's totally fine. You could have, a company name .identity library that you might share, and maybe you distribute that internally as a NuGet package that people use, or even just a shared class library. So it wouldn't necessarily have to live in infrastructure. In this case, it is, because it's the only authentication and identity provider for, let's say the whole company is for this one app. But if you had a bunch of different apps inside your company and you wanted to share that, it might make sense to pull that out into its own separate library. I wouldn't put it in shared kernel for all the same reasons I mentioned about the domain model. You generally don't want to have that coupling to a particular implementation detail, like application user or identity DB context or those things, be inside shared kernel any more so than you would want that in your domain model or your core project. Does that answer your question, Victor? Cool, yep. Thank you. Anybody else? Going back to the template, why would the iEmail sender be inside core? Well, the rule I usually use for interfaces like that is if I can put it in core, I will. And so the reason why iEmail sender is in core, even though it sounds a little bit low level, is that you would think you could abstract something like messaging a little better and have some generic iMessage service or something. But it turns out that doesn't really work very well in practice. Because whether you're sending an email or sending an SMS text message or some other type of notification, they always have different sets of parameters that they expect. And so I've found it to be useful to just treat email as email. But I don't take on any dependency on a particular library or even protocol. Whether you're sending an email by actually sending something to port 25 on localhost or some mail server versus calling a web service for SendGrid or something else, and everything is done through an HTTP context. Those are implementation details. At the email sender abstraction level, all we care about are strings, right? We care about the from email, the to email, the subject, and the body. Now, it could be that you might need attachments and other things on top of that for certain scenarios. And it might be the case that at some point you want to put something with a very implementation specific parameter might force it to not go in the core of the application or the domain model. But my rule for putting stuff in core generally is if I can, I will. And by if I can, I mean if I can do it without breaking the rules. And the biggest rule for application core is, or core if you're in my template, is that it can't bring in a dependency on some implementation detail. Right. And so if I need to, let's say I want to send emails, but I'm using Azure and all my attachments are going to be stored as Azure Blob Storage. And so I create an interface that says I want to send an email and one of the parameters is an Azure Blob Storage type. Right. Well, I can't put that in core because now core would depend on Azure Blob Storage. And so I would be forced to put that interface in infrastructure, let's say. But if I can abstract it in some other way, if I can use a stream or if I can use a file name or I can use a file ID, or something like that, that's just an int or a string or something that doesn't tie me to an implementation, then I'm fine to put that in the core project. Does that make sense? Would this be considered as a domain service since it's not tied to any aggregate, the email sender? Well, it depends where it lives. So yeah, if Sarah, do you want to switch back to the Clean Architecture template and look at the
Sure.
core project where we have the email sender?
Yep.
I consider it a domain service if it lives in core services. So if you expand services,
Oh,
we'll
and
see.
services. Hold on. Go back to services. Got it.
Yeah, right. There's not an email sender service there. Right.
Nope.
So email sending is in infrastructure, I'm pretty sure, we have SMTP email sender and fake email sender. So I wouldn't typically call those a domain service because they don't really have any domain logic in them. Now, if I were doing domain logic and something inside of it, let's go back to core services to see an example. Basically, if it's in core services, I think of it as a domain service because it's living as everything in core is part of the domain. Some folks will call core domain as the name of the project, and that works too. And so to do item search service lives here, so it is a domain service. There could be a service at the domain service level that uses sending an email, right? But it would do so with the interface, not with an implementation, and that would be a domain service at that level. But the implementations that are in infrastructure, I don't call those domain services. I would call those adapters typically. I don't necessarily have that name on these, but like SMTP email sender, that's an adapter for email sender that uses local SMTP. And if I wanted to create another one that used SendGrid or MailChimp or something like that, it would just be another adapter. Does that make sense? Cool.
There was another question about having any tools or templates that you use within the project to ensure that the patterns are followed once that infrastructure is set up.
The biggest pattern with clean architecture is the dependency flow, right? And so just by having this solution, it kind of enforces the biggest rule, which is that your core stuff does not depend on infrastructure, but infrastructure depends on core. Now, a secondary rule is that stuff in web doesn't directly depend on infrastructure either. And there isn't anything in the default template that prevents that. Now, what you can do if you want is you can remove the project reference from web to infrastructure and then just load the infrastructure DLL as part of your build process. So you can compile infrastructure and then copy the DLL to the bin folder in web and then load it. And what that'll do is it'll make it so that if you do reference infrastructure directly anywhere in web, it just won't compile because it won't have that project reference. And so that's one way you can enforce it. Another way that you can add some enforcement for some of these rules or guidelines is to use a tool called ArchUnit or ArchUnit.net, which I've been meaning to do some more content around, like a blog post or YouTube video. I haven't had a chance yet. But if you just Google for ArchUnit, ArchUnit Net specifically, it is a set of unit tests that you can apply to your code base, and it will let you run queries that say, or add rules, let's say, that say anything in the web namespace should not have a direct reference to anything in the infrastructure namespace, or something, nothing in core should have a reference to anything that's a DB context, let's say. Right, and so you can do those type of reflection-based or type-based rules and write them as sort of like unit tests, but at the architecture level. So they're not included here, but it would be something you could do if you wanted. So that was a question from Dylan Moss, it looks like. Did that answer your question, Dylan? Cool.
I've made a note here to include a link to the ArchUnit Net stuff in the follow-up email so that you all have that as well.
Cool. Am I involved in the eShop on Containers project? Minimally. I was involved when it was first created, but I haven't really touched it since, I don't know, 2018 maybe. So it's been a few years. I help update the book that goes with the project, but I haven't touched the source code on the project itself in a few years. Victor asked. All right, any last questions? We're about out of time. All you, Sarah. Wrap it
All
up.
right. Well, if you do have any questions, please feel free to either reach out to us here on the contact us, or if you end up emailing me, I know that's my email address that's coming through on the mailing list. I will either look at your question and answer you directly, or I will forward it to the necessary party as needed. But we are definitely looking forward to doing more of these webinars to showcase various things that we do here throughout the community and through our work here at Nimble Pros. So if there are any other questions, please feel free to reach out and let us know so that we can get back with you or write a blog post and share with the community as well. Thank you all for coming.